Good evening, friends. Welcome. This is Mike Scott at Farm Table Foundation. It's delightful to have you all with us. We'll wait a couple minutes or a minute or two before everyone else joins us. But in the meantime, glad to have you here for Flaky Scones and Biscuits with Sylvia Burgos Toftness. And yeah, Sylvia is one of our regular instructors these days. She's also our board chair, so very involved in the organization. And also is on the board of MOSES, the Midwestern Organic Sustainable Education Society. So very involved in local food movement and also is a grass-fed beef farmer. And she comes to us after years in the kind of radio and marketing PR world as a journalist and so on. So Sylvia, thank you as always for being here. We're delighted to have you. And why don't you just take it away and we'll chat a bit more at the end about our mission, and always, folks, if you have questions, add them into the chat box.
Great. Oh, thanks an awful lot, Mike, and I really appreciate these opportunities to participate in the Zoom, to sort of meet people from all over the country, and I guess that's the first question that I have. Could you use the chat box and let us know what city and state or country you might be from? I'm always surprised by how extensive the reach is of these Zoom classes. So please use this opportunity right now to do that.
We have someone from Canada, from North Carolina, from Chicago, from Plymouth, Minnesota, from St. Paul on Hudson, Mary from North Florida. Yeah, this is great.
Oh, I love it. I love it. In this time of disconnection, it just makes me feel so much more connected to people, and that I appreciate. I really do. All right, let me ask the second question. How many of you do make either scones or biscuits on a regular basis? And if you've never made either one, let me know that too.
Jordan says he only made it once. Carolyn's tried a bunch, but don't make them well. Also have someone here from Maine and Maureen on St. Croix, Minnesota. Someone else says, I don't have experience making either one, though I cook a lot. Someone else said burned, just burned.
Yeah, it's kind of surprising how little time it takes to bake either a biscuit or a scone in the oven. All right, well, thank you so much. It helps us to understand kind of where we all are. And certainly I did not grow up in a baking family. I grew up in the inner city of New York, and from a Hispanic background, Puerto Rican culture that did not have a baking tradition. So a lot of what I've picked up has been more recent. And if I can pick it up, I'm hoping that you can pick it up too. And certainly the biscuit and the scone that we're going to be focusing on today employ a food processor so that it can be a little bit easier for all of us. Now, I suspect that one of you might ask, but what if I don't have a food processor? Do I have to use a food processor? And the answer is no. But we'll get into that a little bit further. What I'd like to do, however, is launch into a slideshow, because I know sometimes with these Zoom classes, especially when you're dealing with a home setting, it isn't necessarily a professional studio, it's kind of hard to see things. So I've pulled together a slideshow that can help you see things a little bit more clearly for at least the biscuit. So we're going to be looking at a slideshow that includes some pictures and video of the biscuit making process. And then we'll take a look at the scone making process kind of live here. So with that, what I'll do, Mike, I'll try to do right now, is launch into our slideshow.
Sounds good, Sylvia. And again, folks, feel free to type your questions in there, and if we don't get to them during the slideshow, we'll get to them afterwards.
All right. There we go. Okay, scones and biscuits made easy. And what you have here are the hands of my very appreciative husband. Very glad that I was giving this Zoom class today because he knew that I would make him one of my taste testers. And so he had some of those biscuits this morning. All right, scones and biscuits, biscuits and scones. Well, these are just some of the words that come up, at least in my mind, when I think about these two kinds of quick breads. They're buttery, they're flaky, they smell wonderful. And some people, when they hear those two words, say, oh my goodness, it's time consuming and it's just too hard to make. Well, I think those first three bullets are true, but the last two don't necessarily have to be. What makes it easier for us as we're looking at just two recipes is the use of a food processor. And also for the biscuit, we'll be utilizing that refrigeration of our holders. All right, our recipes are going to be very basic, especially the scone. That's a pretty basic scone. But the salt and pepper biscuit is going to give us a little bit of an advantage because it is a recipe that you'll be able to use and make if you actually want to make and assemble your biscuits hours before you actually bake them. Okay, so what's the difference between a biscuit and a scone? Well, there is some. They are, however, anchored in the same basic ingredients. Most of the same basic ingredients as you see listed here. Flour, and I am talking about gluten-containing flour. So I'm not talking about quinoa flour, and I'm not talking about almond flour or flax flour. I am talking about a basic all-purpose flour for these two recipes. Can you try to make a biscuit and scone with a non-gluten or a gluten-free flour? Yes, but not these two right here. We can actually address that separately at another time. They both use either baking powder or baking soda or both, and some kind of fat. So it's either a butter, a lard, or a vegetable or a vegetable thing. Coconut oil, I don't know. Will these two recipes work with an oil like olive oil or canola? No, they will not. And they all utilize these scones and biscuits use a liquid of some kind, usually milk or cream or a buttermilk. Then they contain some salt and some sugar. Now, the difference, scones contain eggs and usually more sugar, and biscuits don't contain eggs. At the same time, what you and I know is that scones can come in all kinds of varieties. You can have them with currants and oranges and dried apricots. You can also have biscuits that cheddar cheese and ham. So consider both the scone and the biscuit as a palette that you could work with. Here's the basic equipment. It's the kind of stuff that most of us have in our kitchen. You've got bowls, you've got measuring cups, you can see them there. These are the measuring cups used for dry ingredients, for flour and sugar. You see the measuring spoons. And of course, in the bigger bowl, you see a spatula, two kinds of pastry brushes. One is silicone, one is a natural hairbrush, and a spoon. And to the lower left, what you see is a digital scale. That's optional, but it's certainly something I use all the time because when you measure your ingredients, end up being more exact. It's recipes, it's our faithful food processor. Other equipment that you'll need for, yes?
I have one question here, following up on the canola oil. Why does oil, I guess in general, not work, or why not canola oil?
All right. It does not work because you actually need the solid fat in order to mix with the flour in a way that the fat actually encapsulates the flour. That's what happens when you cut in a fat, make either a scone, a biscuit, or even a pie crust. you actually have to encapsulate the flour. And when you encapsulate the flour, what you do is that you protect that grain of flour from coming in too quick a contact with the liquid that you add to the biscuit or to the scone. And that's why. Now, can you make scones? Can you make cakes using oil? Probably. I really don't know about the biscuit and the scone, to be honest. I know that you can make cakes with various liquid oils. But for these two recipes, you do need the harder fat. All right. Now here we are with some of our basic ingredients. And it's not a very long list, is it? You've got in the upper right, you've got the flour. Right next to it, going left, you've got your liquid. In this case, for this first recipe that I'll be making after the slideshow is over, we're using milk. In the recipe for the salt and pepper biscuit, we actually use half and half. Yes, half and half. These are not low necessarily quick breads. Fortunately, each little quick bread is small. Right next to the milk, you've got some powdered baking powder. There's an egg. There's a little bit of salt in that little blue bowl. And there you've got the measuring spoon. Right beneath the bowl of flour, you've got a stick of butter sitting there. All right. Now, about salt. In the recipe that you have, I'm hoping that you have it, and if you don't, we'll certainly get it to you. The first recipe, or the second one, I think it's a salt and pepper biscuit, calls for a measurement of kosher salt, which is a big grained salt. Now, you may be aware that salts come in different sizes of grains. The kosher salt grain is big. The fine sea salt grain is very small by comparison, as you can see here. So one of the things that we do know is that if you were to measure these two things by volume, you know, teaspoon to teaspoon, there'd be a whole lot more salt in the fine salt teaspoon color grain. And so we have to compensate for that by knowing that if your recipe calls for a full teaspoon of kosher salt, you're probably only going to use a little less than 3/4 of a teaspoon of fine sea salt. Now there is an extra ingredient in the salt and pepper biscuit, and that is Maldon sea salt. It's a smoked salt that has a huge, very flaky grain, as you can see here. In fact, many of the crystals in Maldon are pyramidal in shape. And this is a naturally drying salt. Certainly you can use another salt instead of the one of Maldon in this recipe, but I just thought you'd be interested in seeing this. For example, here we've got 3 other kinds of salts. On the left, you've got Hawaiian. On the right, you've got Himalayan. And in the middle, you have a darkly smoked salt. All of these have very large grains. And before using them as a finishing salt, that means something that you'd add to your plate just before serving it or eating it yourself, or just before baking. You would grind these down to a smaller size so that whoever is munching on your food doesn't hit this pebble as they do so. These various salts have different flavors. They really do contribute different things. You just have to work with them a little and they'll really shine. Hold on a second. There we go. go. So here are the basic steps. Yes.
You use those salts both, you know, in the baking process as well as the finishing one, or
No.
the big ones are just, yeah, can you describe that?
When you are baking or cooking, you would tend to use a basic fine grained sea salt or the kosher salt. You can use that as well. In the cooking and in the baking dough, use those two at your discretion, allowing for the different size grains. A finishing salt is used for just that. It's used at the end of the whole cooking process and just as you're going to eat the food. So a finishing salt is only used to salt something just as you're going to eat it. You do not cook with it. I hope we can certainly talk a little bit more about that. The finishing salt adds a flavor. It adds a different kind of crunch. You would then examine your salt. If it's a really huge grain, as in that Himalayan salt, that's a big grain. That looks like a small pebble. It's like a crabble. I'd grind it down a little bit before using it. All right, you assemble all your ingredients. Here are the basic steps, as you would with any kind of cooking. Have all the ingredients at room temperature or as specified in your recipe. This is really, really important because a room temperature egg, a room temperature butter, a room temperature glass of milk really acts differently than something that is cold. These ingredients do not mix well, do not perform well, do not whip up well if they're not at the temperatures that are required in your recipe. So you want to read your recipes through and understand what temperatures are required for your other ingredients. You can preheat your oven, and please give yourself enough time to do that. If you stick a scone or a biscuit into a cold oven, you're going to end up with a grease splotch at the end because that biscuit or the scone is going to melt before it bakes. That's why preheating is really important. Prepare your baking sheet, cover it with parchment. This is something that haven't done much before. We can talk about it a little bit more. Then you get into the actual mixing of your biscuit or scone. You combine the dry ingredients in the food processor. That's the first step. Then you add the fat, and that's called cutting in the fat. And you mix that up in your food processor as a next step. Then you add the liquid. You don't add the liquid before the fat. You got to make sure that you do it in this order. Then you take your dough out of the food processor. You roll it out. You cut your scones or biscuits, and then you bake them. 10 steps. All right, so I'm adding baking powder, salt, sugar, and I'm adding it to the food processor that already has the flour in it. And I'm pulsing it with just a few pulses in order to combine the dry ingredients together. So that's all this is. Now we add the butter. And this butter, I cut it up into small pieces and wrapped it up and put it into the freezer for 15 minutes just to make sure that it was kept very, very cold. And as I put the pieces into the food processor, I'm tossing them in the flour a little bit so that the butter pieces will not stick to one another. Now this is unsalted butter, and that's important too.
Unsalted butter.
All right.
So someone
Now
asked
we're going to use go right ahead.
about putting a whole stick in the freezer, but you'd recommend cutting it up and then freezing the butter?
Yeah, usually we all kind of refrigerate our butter. And what I do is cut it up and then stick it back into the freezer again to make sure that it remains very, very cold. Yes.
So the butter does not need to be soft first.
No, it does not. If in fact you can take out the butter from your freezer and cut it up, that's just as well. You do not have to soften it first. And here we are looking at the size of the butter pieces that are in that processor after having pulsed it like 12 times. And what we wanted was to have butter pieces that were the size still of a pea. So we don't want to make this very fine. Now we're going to add the half and half. And that half and half was also stored in the freezer for just 15 minutes to make sure it was super cold. And what we're doing is that we've got the food processor on continuous run, pouring the half and half through the funnel and just mixing it up enough so that we could see if it comes together. So now we're going to see, did it come together? Is it forming a dough? There it is. Now we're ready to take the next step, which is to put it out on a floured surface in order to roll it out, to knead it and to roll it out. Okay.
Sylvia,
So here's Oh, all right. Well, that is an oversight. Hold on. Let's see. Hold on. Let me. Okay. I will, it must be something like 1 teaspoon of kosher salt, which is about 3/4 teaspoons of fine sea salt. All right, so here we are. We have floured our surface, and you can see that it's really got a lot of flour on it. So don't be shy about putting quite a bit of flour on your work surface, on the rolling pin, and on your hand. And we're going to take that dough and dump it right onto that flour. Here we go. And what you're going to see is that that flour still looks somewhat crumbly, which makes us initially think, oh my goodness, I need to add more liquid, but you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. What you're going to do is knead it and pull those crumbles together in order to make a more solid ball. All right. Now you're not kneading it like you would bread. It's really a much more short kind of action. You're just pushing on it a little bit. And forgive me for seeing just more of my arm than you are of that dough. But we're pulling it together in order to make a formed dough ball. And you're using some strength, but you're not slapping it around. It's not like making bread, because when you slap dough around, you develop the gluten strands, and that makes for a tough, tough biscuit. All right, so we're getting to a disc. And from there, we're going to then roll out the dough. Now, in this particular picture, what you see is that we have rolled out the dough, and we'll see it again when I actually do the demo here live. And we're going to be using a 2¼ inch cookie cutter. And what I did this morning when I was cooking early in the morning was actually divide this recipe in two. I made 4 of those biscuits this morning so that my husband could enjoy them. And I put the rest on the bigger cookie sheet so that I could make them later this evening, which I did. Now you see that I'm dipping that cookie cutter in flour so that it does not stick to the dough. You don't want to be twisting that cookie cutter. You just want it to go up and down. All right, so now 4 of those biscuits are going into a small cake pan, a square, and the others are going to be distributed to the larger cookie sheet that you can see a little bit in the distance. Sorry again about seeing more of my shirt than of the biscuits, but there it goes. All right, and we rolled this dough out to about 1/2 inch thickness. You could make it a little thicker if you like. And another trick is if you put the biscuits close together, they will tend to rise a little bit more. If you make them, let's say 2 inches instead of 2¼ they'll also seem to rise a bit. And here I am pulling together the remains, and I'm smashing them together. And there are 2 schools of thought about this. Some people refuse to re-roll, and others say, no, 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 you can re-roll and cut again. So we're doing it as a re-roll and a cut and seeing how it's going to turn out. So it's kind of like a workshop that we're doing here. Okay, so we're cutting out a few more, putting it onto the big sheet. There we go. And we're even going to have an irregularly shaped one. There we go. All right. All right. Now these are going to be wrapped in plastic and put into the fridge, as you would if you were going to assemble your biscuits the night before a big breakfast, or if you had time at 10 o'clock in the morning and you wanted to get started on the biscuits that you wanted to bake for a dinner that night, which is what I did. And plastic wrap, of course, always poses its own challenges and disadvantages, but it's what we're working with right now. So I've covered them loosely, but I do want to get the edges down so that they don't dry. And those now go into the fridge. All right, so here are the 4 biscuits that I started that were going to be made this morning. And what we're doing is they're sitting there and they're going to get an egg wash. So the egg wash is made with 1 broken egg mixed really, really well with 1 tablespoon of half and half. And there are different kinds of washes that you can use on scones and biscuits and bread. This is just one kind. And it does add a sheen. It also makes whatever you're going to sprinkle on them adhere to the surface. So I just walked over to my own dining room table and picked up my pepper grinder and my Maldon salt. And again, Maldon is an imported smoked salt. And here are the crystals again. You can see that bit of a shine. And those grains are huge. It's a flake. It's a very big flake. And so you want to use it sparingly. You want to use them sparingly because they really pack a punch in your food. And you can use, of course, these finishing salts, you know, if you're serving scrambled eggs, or if you're doing asparagus or anything. It's kind of fun. They kind of add a little bit of adventure to your table. It's an awfully good finishing salt. And there's our pepper grinder. We're adding coarsely ground pepper to this. All right. These go into the preheated oven, which was set at 450 degrees. All right. All right, now, let's see how we stop sharing. All right. Let's see here.
Yeah, we can see you now, Sylvia.
All right, thank you. You know what? Just before our Zoom started, I took those biscuits, the salt and pepper biscuits that I had put in plastic. I baked those just before our class started today, and just before we started the class, they came out of the oven, and this is what they ended up looking like. Nice and tall, nice and brown. A recipe that works. So this is something that you can have in your armory of different kinds of recipes to have on hand in order to make things ahead and have it ready for that breakfast that you've got either guests coming to, or you just don't want to get out of your pajamas, or for a dinner. So these are here, and in fact, I'm going to be eating these with some of my serrano pepper jelly. So you guys, I wish you were here to eat these with me too. All right. So that's the biscuit. Let's go to the scone. And this is something that's made fast. All right.
Hey, Sylvia, one question about the temperature of the items, because I remember you saying it was really important to pay attention to that and that they should be room temperature.
Everything should be at room temperature. No, everything should be at room temperature except it's specified differently.
Okay, so the butter and the cream in this case
were icy cold.
Okay.
Yes. Now, in this scone recipe, everything is room temperature, which is really counter what a lot of people think about when they're making scones or biscuits. They think, well, the butter's got to be cold, the water's got to be cold, the milk has got to be cold. But in this specific recipe, everything is room temperature. And so here we've got our food processor. And here we've got our flour. We've got 3 cups of flour that I'm adding to the food processor.
In terms of the baking process, Sylvia, is it okay to use a convection oven or best to bake normally? Does it matter?
Yes, it does. Good question. Very good question. You do not want to use a convection oven because it will encourage the outside of the scone or biscuit to bake and solidify before it's fully risen. And so it'll stop that rising process by baking the outside too fast. And so you want to turn off that convection feature in your oven when doing something like this. Flour. And I'm always referring back to my recipe because I've made this recipe a gazillion times and I always go back to take a look at it. All right. Okay. Here's the sugar. Here's the salt. Here's the baking powder. And this calls for quite a bit of baking powder, 2 tablespoons. So, got this on, and we're going to pulse it just to combine the dry ingredients. you do want to get that baking powder well distributed. All right, that's done. Now the next step, excuse me, is to add the butter and to pulse it until it is fully incorporated into the flour. Now, you may or may not remember, but when we made the salt and pepper biscuits, we were looking to have pieces of butter that were still very, very, very visible in the mix when we got to the point where we wanted to stop mixing the butter in. We wanted to see pieces of butter that were the size of a pea. That's not the case at all with making this scone. What we want is to fully incorporate that butter into the flour so that it's not even seen. It's more like sand than anything else. So here's the butter. I had cut it up and then let it come to room temperature. It's not melted. That's another thing. Melted butter is not the same as room temperature butter. They really react very, very differently in the baking process. So you do not want melted butter. You want room temperature butter, but it's still solid. All right. Now we're going to pulse it again. And we're going to do it about 15 to 20 pulses. It's a lot of pulses. Okay, we did it 15, and I'm going to take a look and see what we've got in the way of, oh, I still see some larger pieces. Okay. Did 20. And again, even though we're using these wonderful appliances and automation, you got to take a look yourself to see how are things going. Much better. It is like sand. That's kind of amazing. Okay. Now we add, okay. Now we add the milk. Oh, I think it's over here. Excuse me. All right, thank you for waiting. All right. Right now we've done this. We transfer all of this now to a bowl. So we're not going to be mixing in the butter there, or rather the milk in here. We're actually going to be taking this off and transferring this to a bowl. Now, one of the things about this particular recipe is that it is amazingly wet dough. So you're going to, I think, be a little bit surprised at just how much, what this thing is like. All right. So we've got our sand-like flour and butter mixture. I'm adding the currants and mixing them in. It's good to have the currants, or when you're adding a raisin, a fruit, or a nut to something like this, to mix it into the flour so that so that the fruits or nuts don't clump together. All right, so here we've got this. Then we're going to break 2 eggs into a bowl.
Sylvia, this is the first time it's been an issue, but it's a little dark now. Do you have another light you can put on the?
Yeah. I certainly will. I know, we went through another season. The light's going away.
Thank you.
Hold on just a second. I think this might be better. All
Thank you.
right.
And someone asked a question too about, swapping out currants for other dried fruits. What about fresh fruits?
Yes, you can swap out other dried fruits. I happen to have the currants, but apricots, raisins, cherries, all of those will work. All of those will work. When it comes to a fresh fruit, like I've often made strawberry scones. It's a different recipe because you have to allow for the great deal of moisture that a strawberry will add to the scone. So you have to allow for that. Usually that means cutting up the strawberry or that wet fruit in really, really small sizes so that it doesn't become like this little puddle in the middle of your scone. I've got a good recipe for it, and I can try to find it to share it if you'd like. Okay, so we're mixing the eggs and the milk. Just gonna check something here. Okay. And it's whole milk. And I know some of you are thinking, oh my goodness, all of this butter fat. Well, it's what makes the recipe work. Are there some recipes that don't use these kinds of liquids? Yes. Yes, but these two recipes that I'm using happen to use the fattier dairy products. All right, so we've mixed this up. And I'm going to take about 2 tablespoons of this milk and egg mixture and reserve it, because that's going to be our egg wash. There we go. Good. Okay, so what's the next step? The next step is to, okay, here's where it gets really wet and fun. We mix this egg mixture into the flour mixture, and we use our spatula to do it. Now, why would we use that instead of just doing it in the food processor? Well, one of the things that we know is that the more that you manipulate flour, wet flour, the more the gluten strands within it develop. Okay, so gluten is a set of proteins within flour that give it strength. It's what allows bread to hold in the gases that are produced by yeast, and those gases make the bread to rise. Now, that kind of strength is something that you don't want in necessarily a flaky scone. And you don't want it in a beautiful chiffon cake. And so that's why different kinds of flours are used for different kinds of baking. So right now we're using an all-purpose flour, which works really, really well for us. When you're making cakes, sometimes you use a cake flour, which has less gluten in it, and so has less opportunity to develop toughness. And we're doing this gently in order to not develop those gluten structures that might make the scone tough. Okay, so this dough, if you want to call it that, this is really wet stuff. Look at this. It's downright goopy. This is our scone dough. Okay, so it has formed a dough, just barely. And now I'm going to really liberally flour my work surface.
Sylvia, while you're at that, a couple other questions about ingredients like ginger and pecans as an additional.
Sounds fantastic.
It does, doesn't it? Yes.
That sounds really, really good. Okay, now I'm taking this dough. All right, like I said, this is a really, really wet dough. And what we're going to do now is we floured the surface. We're flouring our hands a lot. And we're going to gently knead this dough. And I mean super gently. You're barely picking it up and pushing it on itself.
Was that pretty similar to how you were kneading the biscuit dough?
This is actually different because this dough is so much more wet. So your handling of this has to be even more gentle. And you're only going to be kneading it, I don't know, 20 times maybe, with really gentle pressure. Again, we don't want to activate the gluten. And as we're kneading it, it is actually gaining strength. It's not that goopy mess it was. All right. Oh, we're just about done here. All right, here we are. And what we're going to do now is here we've got a rolling pin. I'm going to liberally flour that as well. And I'm just going to roll this out. And that's it. Because we're looking at something that's about 1 inch thick. Here I am flouring. Remember, flouring my cutter. And the cutter I'm using this time around is only 1 3/4 inches in diameter. And I've got my prepared baking sheet right next to me. Okay, so here I'm doing it. I'm cutting out rounds of dough. These scones are very British in their size. They're not these oversized things that you tend to find in the American coffee shop, but much more in keeping with what I was familiar with in England. And when you make them small, then you don't feel so bad about having two. Now you can make these bigger. You certainly can make these bigger if you like. I make these every time I hold a high tea on the farm. And usually we serve these with a lemon curd or a cranberry curd or a honeyberry curd. And some lightly whipped cream. And the thing that I like about making scones and biscuits is that it almost takes no time at all to bake them. They get done so fast. Now I'm actually, again, combining the scraps, pressing them out. in order to get as many scones as I can out of this thing.
While she's at that, folks, Sylvia mentioned her high tea, which she sometimes has out on her farm, at least in normal times, which is a really fun event, and where she teaches and you get to learn more about her farm as well. So I'm just going to put in the chat box the website for her farm, Bullbrook Keep.
Oh, thanks a lot, Mike. All right, so here we have our, excuse me for stepping out there. Here we have our scones all lined up. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to brush them with that egg wash. Because that's going to add a nice sheen.
I may have missed this, Sylvia, but is the pan just gently oiled before you put the scones on, or?
No, the pan is lined with parchment paper, which does several things. One, it acts as a surface that your baking product will not adhere to. So things lift off of parchment paper super swell. Helps with cleanup. Really is something that I don't even bake without anymore. Okay, so here we've got all these scones. Let's see, how many do I have here? I've got 24 here. I'm going to pop these into the oven, and it'll be done in 12 minutes. All right. So, let's see. Great. Yeah, they'll be done really quickly. So this gives us some time, I think, for other kinds of questions that you might have. I guess I've got a question. Did anybody come from a household where you had a father or an uncle or a grandmother that was a really super baker? And what did they make?
Catherine does have a question about trying to use a blender in place of the food processor.
It's probably not going to work unless you've got a Vitamix, because the strength of a blender is that it pulls things down into a vortex in order to be able to blend and mix. And with the food processor, it's really more of a cutting action. And so I don't think you'd get the same results. You'd also probably get a lot more heat buildup at the blade in the blender because of that pulling down activity.
So if you don't have a food processor, then it's more by hand in terms of the mixing?
Yeah, it'll be more by hand, and certainly that's the way everybody used to do it a zillion years ago. So what does that mean when you do it by hand? You've got your flour, right? You'll always have your flour, and you'll have whatever fat that you're using. What you would tend to do, depending on your recipe, and for most of these biscuits and most of these scones, you're actually using cold butter. What you would do is, well, what I would recommend doing is to slice your butter into 1/8 inch pieces. So they're thin slices. Slice your whatever amount of butter that you're using, slice it into 1/8 inch slices or thinner. Make them cold again. And then use your fingers, add those pieces to your flour and kind of mix them in gently so that they're kind of enwrapped in the flour. Then use your fingers to rub the butter into the flour. So you're rubbing them in. You're rubbing it in with your fingers. And that actually works beautifully. Rubbing butter into flour is a time-honored technique and you can absolutely do it. You can absolutely do it. One of the things to think about as you're contemplating, well, how am I going to make this thing, and why does it work, or why does it not work? One of the things that happens when you have butter that's been flaked in that way, or that has larger pieces, is that not only does it add a wonderful mouthfeel and beautiful flavor, but that butter, as it's baking, steams. Yeah, because butter has a lot of liquid, a lot of water in it. The butter steams and helps to make that baked product rise. If you've ever eaten a croissant or anything made with a puff pastry, those kinds of baked goods have many, many, many layers of butter in them. And in fact, they're called laminated baking products, laminated pastries. And part of the reason why they rise is because as they bake, the butter steams and actually puffs out the flour or the dough. And that's why that works. You're not going to get that same kind of activity with an oil. It will not happen because there's no water in it.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. And Catherine, I think you had a question. If you wanted to try again, please.
Muted. Thank you. I was just going to respond to the question about growing up with baking, which I certainly did. And both of my grandmothers mostly baked like lots of pies and sweetbreads and things like that. But I think we just had pie year round, every kind of pie imaginable. I really miss their crusts and watching them bake.
Oh, what a wonderful memory. Certainly pies, that was something that I did not grow up with. And I'll be real honest with you, I didn't even like pies up until just recently, but it was because I'd never had a really good one. Now that I've begun to have pies that are made by people who know what they're doing and they're working with really good ingredients, man, I really appreciate pies and that magic of making a great pie crust. That's really something, really something. It turns out that my stepdaughter is an excellent pie maker. She is amazing. And she's really my guru when it comes to making pies. Yeah,
well,
that's
it's such a great way to use the seasonal fruits. And our favorite was, my sisters and I would pick the blueberries deep in the woods, like the wild ones. And then that's my favorite.
Oh my gosh, just having access to wild blueberries. Most of us have never tasted anything like that and have never kind of enjoyed the intensity of that flavor. That's not only a great memory, you know, for you, but to me, it's a wonderful statement about how very knowledgeable and resourceful our grandparents and great-grandparents were, that knew how to use what was available in each season and work with that. One of the things that I've just begun getting into myself right now is making dinner pies. So these are savory pies, you know, chicken, beef, vegetables, curries, in order to understand better how to make different kinds of pie crusts. And because we raise beef, certainly understand how to use different kinds of cuts in that kind of baking. Because one of the things that's wonderful about pie is that you can freeze them. You can make them big, you can make them small, and you can freeze them so that you can have them on hand whenever you want them.
And related to that, Sylvia, someone has a question about preparing scones or biscuits in advance and then freezing them to bake later. That's possible?
You know, I don't know. I've never tried it. I know there are people who are very expert at that. I know that you can make, let's say, these salt and pepper biscuits and hold them for up to, I think, 24 hours before baking them. But I do know that there are ways of, sometimes they're called par baking them. So you partially bake them, freeze them, and then take them out again and complete them. And, you know, I think that that's a wonderful question and a great challenge. And I'm going to take it up. I'm going to find out what the answer to that might be, because that's something I myself would like to know. Certainly, I explored what you can do with cakes in way of freezing them before presenting them at an event. But in those instances, you actually bake cakes completely, cool them completely, and then do a very thorough job of wrapping them before you freeze them. That's how you preserve cakes, and you can hold them for 3 to 6 months that way.
Thanks, Sylvia. A question here. Just back to that kosher salt and how much to be used with the biscuits in the biscuit recipe. And I believe and it looks like, folks, in your chat box, if you're following there, someone talks about freezing them and says they don't always bake up the best, but your kids love them. So someone here has tried freezing them, and
all right,
works pretty well, it sounds like.
Okay, here we go. Yes, it is 1 teaspoon of kosher salt. I had it down here on my notes, but it didn't get transcribed into that final recipe. So thank you very much for asking about that. I'm just going to check on the scones that are kind of baking up in the oven to see how well they're doing.
Hi there, Sylvia.
Here are scones. They really smell good, guys. I hate to say that. Wow. And so we would just let these sit here for 10 minutes or so, and then serve those with your melted butter or whatever. I'm just going to step away again. Here we go. Just looking for a pair of tongs. Oh, all right. So here we've got the height that we want in our scone. Whoa. It easily doubled in height. They browned really nicely, and that's due in part to that egg wash that we used. And when they're this small, again, the cookie cutter was only 1 3/4 inches. You can eat a cup and not feel badly about it. And I will be having one of these with some blood orange marmalade from the farm table that I happen to have on hand, because they're doing a great job with preserving through the season. Well, that's it.
Well, Sylvia, I just wanted to say thank you. And also a number of people throughout the class have been saying how much they appreciate your excellent explanations. So appreciating that.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. All of this baking and cooking is such a joy. I feel very privileged to be able to do it and to join you for these classes. It's been a lot of fun. Again, if people want to contact me with questions or suggestions, I would hope that you would. I would hope that you would. And Mike, will you provide them with my contact information or pass their questions along to me?
I'll do that when I send the information out about the video link and so on.
Oh, good, good.
So thanks everybody, and thank you, Sylvia.
Yeah.
Look forward to hopefully having you in another class soon. And I did type in our restaurant's number, the 715-268-4500, if you want to call and reserve a spot or just find out what's going on there, because we've got some great local food being served there, seasonal food year round.
It's excellent. You guys have got to know that there are many restaurants that claim to be farm to table, but there are almost none that actually pull their foods from so small a radius and so large a percentage of their food is local. It is an amazing restaurant with really excellent chefs and cooks and bakers. You'd have a very good meal.
Well, thank you again, everybody. It's a delight to have you with us, and safe. Take care of each other, and hope to see you soon. Thank you, Sylvia,
Good
and
enough.
good night.
Thanks a lot. Good night, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Hey,
You're
thank
very-
you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
We appreciate that, everyone. Thank you very much.
Have a good night.